RuBru means face-to-face in the Urdu language. If you are a Muslim, the RuBru-ftf series can help you find your bearings on where Muslims stand today in relation to their recent past. All viewers may find many of the misconceptions floating around, corrected by the information the RuBru-ftf series supplies. DMSR stands for Do Muslims Still Regress? The basic question of the DMSR series inevitably deals with the compatibility of the Muslim attitude with the Age of Enlightenment. The history of systematically ignoring Muslim contribution to knowledge and bringing it back into view is quite interesting. The scholars and researchers who lead the effort to recover this view are the ones whose earlier generations systematically ignored them. An attempt to Europeanize knowledge is a part of the recently discovered history of science. Muslims' contribution to science was ignored entirely until recent times. The narrative that science and the scientific method largely came from the ancient Greek world has been a common belief of Europeans for centuries. The Muslim contribution was seen only as the preservation of the Greek sciences, which Muslims eventually passed on to Europe totally unchanged. Some scholars have been rather harsh on Muslims, like physicist-philosopher-historian Pierre Duhem, d. 1916, who suggested that Muslims were fanatic, rampaging hordes, burners of Greek science, and also pale imitators, copiers of the Greeks. He believed that there is no Arabian science. The wise men of Mohammedanism were always the more or less faithful disciples of the Greeks, but were themselves destitute of all originality. Recent discoveries in the history of science tell us a different story. They demolish the narrative that science appeared and developed only in Europe. More importantly, they highlight the original contribution to knowledge made by Muslims. The mainstream Western scholarship today is in line with the view John William Draper, d. 1882, expressed in The Intellectual Development of Europe. I have to deplore the systematic manner in which the literature of Europe has continued to put out of sight our obligations to the Mohammedans. Surely, they cannot be much longer hidden. Injustice founded on religious rancor and national conceit cannot be perpetuated forever. The Arab has left his intellectual impress on Europe. He has indelibly written it on the heavens, as anyone may see who reads the names of the stars on a common celestial globe. Today's scientific literature is full of information on the high quality and the staggering quantity of Muslim contributions to science. It shows that Muslim scientists were quite active in a range of fields very similar to the present-day disciplines of knowledge. The change of view is part of a regular stream of publications of the Western scholarly community, which contains a substantial amount of reliable literature on the subject for scholars and the general reader. Recent microhistorical work has unearthed conclusive evidence of the journey of knowledge from the Muslim world to Europe. The time restriction has forced us to omit details of the microhistorical findings from this video. George Saliba, professor of Arabic and Islamic science at Columbia University, has published more than 8 books and nearly 200 articles dealing with Arabic/Islamic science and technology and the relationship between Arabic/Islamic science and Renaissance Europe. His article entitled, Whose Science is Arabic Science in Renaissance Europe? And the research of many other scholars reveal amazing facts. Part of the research relates to Copernicus's groundbreaking work, 1473 to 1543. The replacement of Ptolemaic by the Copernican system of astronomy is conventionally held to be an achievement of the early Renaissance in European civilization. Characterized by the surge in interest in classical scholarship, the Renaissance served as a stepping stone for the European movement to the present age from the Middle Ages. According to Saliba, recent research has established that the mathematical edifice of Copernican astronomy could not have been built, as it was finally built, by just using the mathematical information available in such classical Greek mathematical and astronomical works as Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest. What was needed, and was in fact deployed by Copernicus himself, was the addition of 2 new mathematical theorems. Both of those theorems were first produced some 3 centuries before Copernicus, and were used by astronomers working in the Islamic world for the express purpose of reforming Greek astronomy. The question is no longer raised as to whether or not Copernicus was aware of the works of his Islamic predecessors, but when, where and in what form he learned of them, as was most recently put by Swerdlow and Neugebauer in their now classic work on the mathematical astronomy of Copernicus. Moreover, we also know that those same theorems, once produced, continued to be extensively used, in various shapes and forms, in Arabic astronomical texts well before the time of Copernicus, contemporaneously with him and even after his time. According to Celeber, the evidence illustrated very briefly here points to the distinct possibility that Arabic manuscripts were being studied in Renaissance Italy during the time of Copernicus in the same fashion we saw them still being studied by Postal and others at a slightly later date. Jonathan Lyons, in his book, The House of Wisdom, How the Arabs Transformed Western Civilization, says, "For centuries following the fall of Rome, Western Europe was a benighted backwater, a world of subsistence farming, minimal literacy, and violent conflicts. Meanwhile, Arab culture was thriving, dazzling those Europeans fortunate enough to visit cities like Baghdad or Antioch. There, philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers were steadily advancing the frontiers of knowledge, as well as keeping alive the works of Plato and Aristotle, when the best libraries in Europe held several dozen books. Baghdad's Great Library, the House of Wisdom, housed 400,000. Jonathan Lyons shows just how much Western ideas owe to the Arab civilization. The discoveries of the Muslim contribution to science have produced literature on how thankful the West should be for the knowledge transferred to it by the Muslims. Robert Briffault, died in 1948, in The Making of Humanity, made a significant observation. What we call science arose in Europe as a result of a new spirit of inquiry, of new methods of experiment, observation, and measurement, of the development of mathematics in a form unknown to the Greeks. That spirit and those methods were introduced into the European world by the Arabs. Arab astronomy did not forestall Copernicus or Newton, though without it there would have been no Copernicus and no Newton. Beyond the recognition of the original contribution of science by Muslims, the recent discoveries trace the impact of the transfer of knowledge from the Arabic world on the European Renaissance. In his book, Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance, George Saliba explains that the foundations of Islamic scientific thought were laid well before Greek sources were formally translated into Arabic. He also shows how the rational methods introduced by Muslims formed the foundation of the European Renaissance. The recent literature contains countless similar publications. Robert Briffault, died in 1948, in The Making of Humanity, makes the following quite significant statement. It is highly probable that but for the Arabs, modern European civilization would never have arisen at all. It is absolutely certain that but for them, it would not have assumed that character which has enabled it to transcend all previous phases of evolution. Robert Briffault further says that it was under the influence of the Arabs and Moorish revival of culture, and not in the 15th century, that a real renaissance took place. Spain, not Italy, was the cradle of the rebirth of Europe. As for medieval Europe, Robert Briffault says that, after steadily sinking lower and lower into barbarism, Europe had reached the darkest depths of ignorance and degradation when cities of the Saracenic world, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordova, and Toledo, were growing centers of civilization and intellectual activity. It was there that the new life arose which was to grow into new phase of human evolution. From the time when the influence of their culture made itself felt began the stirring of new life. It was under the successors to the Muslims of Spain that Roger Bacon learned Arabic and Arabic sciences. Neither Roger Bacon nor later namesake has any title to be credited with having introduced the experimental method. Roger Bacon was no more than one of the apostles of Muslim science and method to Christian Europe, and he never wearied of declaring that knowledge of Arabic and Arabic sciences was for his contemporaries the only way to true knowledge. According to Briffault, discussions as to who was the originator of the experimental method are part of the colossal misinterpretation of the origins of European civilization. The experimental method of Arabs was by Bacon's time widespread and eagerly cultivated throughout Europe. George Sarton, in his famous Introduction to the History of Science, says, "We have reason to believe that when, during the Crusades, Europe at last began to establish hospitals, They were inspired by the Arabs of Near East. The first hospital in Paris, Les Quinzvingt, was founded by Louis IX after his return from the Crusade 1254 to 1260. According to RuBru-ftf, science is the most momentous contribution of Arab civilization to the modern world, but its fruits were slow in ripening. Not until long after Moorish culture had sunk back into darkness did the giant, which it had given birth to, rise in his might. It was not science only which brought Europe back to life. Other and manifold influence from the civilization of Islam communicated its first glow to European life. In short, in RuBru-ftf's words, there is not a single aspect of European growth in which the decisive influence of Islamic culture is not traceable. Nowhere is it so clear and momentous as in the genesis of that power which constitutes the permanent distinctive force of the modern world and the supreme source of its victory, natural science and the scientific spirit. With quotes like the ones above, one can go on and on. The truth seems to be progressively attracting a huge number of rational minds who respect Muslims' contribution to science. The quotes presented so far amply prove the points highlighted by George Saliba's works. If you like this video, please share it and hit the subscribe button so that the next videos can reach you easily.